Welcome back to Strides to Solutions. I'm Esther Adams, and today we're shifting from understanding the mechanisms that trap people in chronic fatigue syndrome cycles to exploring evidence based interventions that can actually help break these patterns. The research reveals that while chronic fatigue syndrome involves complex neurobiological dysfunction, there are specific techniques and approaches that can help restore more adaptive brain function and reduce the psychological patterns that perpetuate symptoms. What makes this research particularly hopeful is that many of these interventions don't require expensive equipment or lengthy treatment programs. They work by targeting the specific brain circuits and cognitive patterns we've identified as problematic, offering people concrete tools for interrupting the cycles that keep them stuck. Let me start with one of the most promising areas: mindfulness-based interventions. The research consistently shows that mindfulness training can effectively shift attention away from fatigue related rumination toward present focused awareness. This isn't just about feeling calmer, it's about literally changing brain activity patterns that maintain chronic fatigue symptoms. The neuroimaging studies reveal that mindfulness training alters brain dynamics in precisely the ways needed to address chronic fatigue syndrome. Specifically, it decreases connectivity in networks associated with rumination while increasing the ability to sustain attention to present moment experiences rather than getting caught in negative thought cycles about symptoms. But here's what's particularly relevant for chronic fatigue syndrome. Mindfulness interventions are effective at reducing what researchers call symptom hypermonitoring while preserving necessary body awareness. This addresses one of the core problems we've identified: the tendency to become hypervigilant to internal sensations in ways that increase rather than decrease symptoms. The research shows that mindfulness training helps people develop what's called non-judgmental awareness, the ability to notice bodily sensations and symptoms without becoming entangled in catastrophic thoughts about them. This breaks the cycle where monitoring symptoms becomes a cognitive load that perpetuates fatigue. Meta-analyses consistently demonstrate that mindfulness-based interventions significantly reduce ruminative thinking, including fatigue-related rumination, with effects that are moderate to large and maintained over time. The mechanisms involve improved attention control and the development of a different relationship to thoughts and sensations. Importantly, these benefits extend beyond just feeling less distressed. The brain imaging research shows that mindfulness training changes default mode network activity, the brain network that becomes overactive during rest in chronic fatigue syndrome and contributes to mental fatigue and crash risk. The default mode network research reveals why traditional rest recommendations often fail in chronic fatigue syndrome. If this network remains overactive during rest periods, physical inactivity doesn't translate to genuine neural recovery. Mindfulness training specifically targets this problem by teaching techniques that quiet mental activity during rest. Moving to more targeted interventions, the research on attention training techniques shows promising results for reducing the cognitive burden of constant symptom monitoring. Specific attention training protocols can reduce attentional bias toward health-related threats without increasing overall anxiety or reducing necessary body awareness. These interventions work by training the brain to shift flexibly between different types of attention, monitoring internal states when appropriate, but also being able to redirect attention externally when continued monitoring becomes counterproductive. The neurofeedback research offers another targeted approach. Studies using real-time brain imaging feedback to normalize prefrontal cortex activity show reductions in rumination and related symptoms. Participants learn to self-regulate brain regions that become overactive during excessive symptom monitoring. This type of training appears to reduce the mental effort required for cognitive control, addressing one of the core mechanisms that makes symptom management so exhausting in chronic fatigue syndrome. The brain becomes more efficient at regulating attention and emotional responses. But perhaps most relevant for daily life are the findings about structured rest interventions. The research reveals that the quality of rest matters more than the quantity for people with chronic fatigue syndrome. Simply resting more doesn't help if the brain remains active in rumination and self referential thinking. Structured mental rest training, techniques like guided imagery, progressive muscle relaxation, and deep breathing significantly improves the restorative quality of downtime compared to passive rest. These approaches reliably reduce stress, promote genuine relaxation, and appear to help normalize the brain patterns that prevent recovery during rest periods. The sleep research adds another crucial piece. Poor sleep quality is linked to disrupted default mode network connectivity, including the kind of overactivity that contributes to post rest crashes. Improving sleep quality helps normalize brain network function and reduces the risk of feeling worse rather than better after rest periods. This explains why many people with chronic fatigue syndrome report feeling exhausted even after sleeping or resting for long periods. The brain's recovery systems aren't functioning properly, so rest doesn't provide genuine restoration. Structured approaches to improving both rest and sleep quality can help restore these natural recovery processes. The research on acceptance and commitment therapy provides evidence for a different type of intervention that addresses the psychological patterns maintaining chronic fatigue cycles. ACT consistently reduces fatigue severity and improves daily functioning by targeting what researchers call psychological inflexibility, the tendency to get stuck in rigid patterns of thinking and responding. ACT interventions help people develop more flexible responses to symptoms and energy fluctuations. Instead of getting caught in all or nothing thinking about activity levels, people learn to make decisions based on values and long term goals rather than moment to moment symptom fluctuations. The research shows that AKT reduces fatigue interference with daily activities and improves quality of life, with effects lasting 6 months or longer. The mechanisms involve developing what's called committed action, the ability to pursue meaningful activities even when symptoms are present, while also learning appropriate pacing and self care. Importantly, ACT doesn't encourage people to ignore symptoms or push through fatigue. Instead, it teaches more skillful ways of responding to symptoms that don't involve either complete avoidance or reckless overexertion. This addresses the boom bust cycle by providing tools for navigating the middle ground between these extremes. The digital tool research offers practical approaches that can be implemented immediately. External pacing cues provided by apps or wearable devices can reduce the cognitive load of constant self monitoring while still supporting appropriate activity management. These tools work by providing objective feedback about activity levels and recovery needs, reducing the need for constant internal monitoring that becomes cognitively exhausting. The research shows that well designed external cues significantly reduce perceived mental effort and can improve task performance while lowering fatigue. This approach recognizes that some level of activity monitoring is necessary for people with chronic fatigue syndrome, but it shifts this monitoring from an internal, subjective process to an external, objective one. This reduces the psychological burden while potentially providing more accurate information about energy levels and recovery needs. But what makes all of these interventions particularly promising is that they can be combined and adapted to individual needs. The research suggests that the most effective approaches address multiple aspects of the chronic fatigue syndrome cycle simultaneously. For example, mindfulness training can be combined with structured rest techniques to address both the rumination patterns that interfere with recovery and the practical skills needed for genuine restoration. Attention training can be paired with ACT approaches to develop both the cognitive skills needed for flexible attention and the psychological flexibility needed for adaptive responding to symptoms. The sleep research suggests that improving sleep quality should be a foundational intervention that supports the effectiveness of other approaches. When sleep provides genuine restoration, other interventions for managing symptoms and activity levels become more effective. However, the research also reveals some important limitations and considerations. These interventions appear to be most effective for people who can engage actively with the techniques and who have at least some capacity for sustained attention and learning. During severe crash phases, the cognitive demands of these interventions might be too great. This suggests that a staged approach might be most appropriate, starting with very basic sleep and rest quality improvements during severe phases, then gradually adding more active interventions as cognitive capacity improves. The research also emphasizes that these interventions work best when they're part of a comprehensive approach that includes appropriate medical care, social support, and accommodation for real energy limitations. They're tools for working more skillfully with chronic fatigue syndrome, not cures that eliminate the need for ongoing management. Importantly, the effectiveness of these interventions appears to depend partly on understanding their rationale. When people understand why hypervigilance maintains symptoms, they're more motivated to engage with mindfulness training. When they understand how rumination interferes with rest, they're more likely to practice structured relaxation techniques. This educational component seems crucial for success. The interventions aren't just techniques to be applied mechanically, they require understanding the underlying mechanisms and making conscious choices about how to respond to symptoms and energy fluctuations. The research on external versus internal focus during rest periods offers a particularly practical insight. For people whose minds remain busy during passive rest, engaging in low effort, externally focused activities like simple puzzles or light reading may be more restorative than unstructured rest. This challenges the common assumption that rest always means doing nothing. For people with default mode network overactivation, activities that gently engage external attention may provide better recovery than passive rest that allows rumination to continue. The neuromodulation research, while more experimental, offers hope for people who don't respond to behavioral interventions alone. Techniques like transcranial direct current stimulation can improve network flexibility between brain regions involved in rest and activity, potentially addressing some of the underlying neurobiological dysfunction. These approaches are still primarily research tools, but they suggest that the brain changes involved in chronic fatigue syndrome are potentially reversible through appropriate interventions that target specific neural circuits. What emerges from this research is a picture of chronic fatigue syndrome as a condition that involves genuine neurobiological dysfunction, but dysfunction that can be addressed through targeted interventions that work with rather than against the affected systems. The key insight is that recovery isn't about forcing the brain and body to function normally through willpower. It's about understanding the specific ways that normal functioning has been disrupted and using evidence based techniques to gradually restore more adaptive patterns. This might involve retraining attention systems that have become biased toward threat detection, restoring rest and sleep systems that have become dysregulated, developing more flexible responses to symptoms and energy fluctuations, and reducing the cognitive burden of constant symptom monitoring. But perhaps most importantly, this research validates that chronic fatigue syndrome is a real medical condition with specific measurable dysfunction, while also offering hope that this dysfunction can be addressed through appropriate interventions. The effectiveness of these approaches depends on recognizing that chronic fatigue syndrome involves multiple interacting systems, and that sustainable improvement often requires addressing several aspects simultaneously. This isn't about finding one magic technique, but about developing a toolkit of evidence based approaches that can be adapted to individual needs and circumstances. The research also emphasizes the importance of pacing these interventions appropriately. Just as physical activity needs to be carefully managed in chronic fatigue syndrome, so does the introduction of new cognitive and psychological techniques. Starting with small, manageable practices and gradually building skills over time appears to be more effective than trying to implement multiple interventions simultaneously. For people currently struggling with chronic fatigue syndrome, this research offers both validation and practical direction. The symptoms and limitations are real and reflect genuine neurobiological changes. But these changes are not necessarily permanent, and there are specific evidence based approaches that can help restore more adaptive functioning over time. The key is approaching recovery as a gradual process of retraining affected systems rather than a matter of pushing through symptoms or waiting passively for improvement. With appropriate tools and support, many of the psychological and neurobiological patterns that maintain chronic fatigue syndrome can be modified. This has been Strides to Solutions. I'm Esther Adams, and thank you for joining me today.